So today we are going to cover a completely optional step in the process of service delivery, but that is helping your clients implement change. So we have gone through the process and we're going to make the assumption that we are in the build out phase and we're doing all of our status reports and change requests as needed. But the one thing that's really optional that will differentiate you as a services provider is if you think about change management prior to completing the build stage and start educating and informing your client about what they can and should expect as a result of the service that you're providing. Whatever service you're providing is going to impact either an employee at the company that you're doing it for. It may impact their vendors. It may impact their customers. And so if you can at least do some basic education about when you're going to be done so that they can be planning and they can be implementing change management, you're going to set both yourself and the client up for a win. I did so many projects where we did all the execution, we would deliver it, and then the client didn't use it for 6 weeks or 8 weeks because they hadn't thought about how they were going to train people and what communications they needed to take into consideration. So the level of change management that they need to do is really dependent on the size of the project, the team size, the number of people that are impacted, if it's an internal project or an external project. So a lot of the same variables that matter in terms of project governance. And as a services provider, you can actually add change management on as additional services that you provide if you would like, or you can just be a value-added provider and educate your client on what it is they can or should be doing so that the work that you've done actually gets used and actually gets implemented. I'm so passionate about making sure that the things that we spend time and money on are actually making a difference in this world. So I want to cover the most basic at the very smallest. You should at least educate your client that whoever their stakeholder is, that there's 5 key types of people and that they need to be thinking about how they're going to communicate the results of the engagement with you to those people, and that they may want to consider developing what their deployment plans are and if there's any training that they need to be thinking about getting scheduled or developing. So this is one of my favorite concepts. This is so applicable for communications on the project. It is applicable for communications to the end users, but people don't like to change. And they don't change just because you want them to. They do it because you're giving them something that is fulfilling one of their basic needs. So you may have heard of what's in it for me and communicating to all the stakeholders or end users what they're going to get out of this. And the messaging honestly needs to be different for different people. And here's how I remember all 5 bases that I need to make sure that I'm covering. One, and I use my hand. So number 1 is if you think about your thumb, you put your thumb up. If these kinds of people, if you're communicating to them, they're really interested in knowing what's in it for them in terms of how it's going to impact their status. Am I doing good? Am I important? Am I number 1? Am I better than somebody else? Those sorts of things. People who are pointer finger people, they're number 2. They're really motivated by security. So, if they are not holding up one finger like, I got it, I'm here, they are typically the people that are pointing their finger at somebody else saying, it's their fault or the reason I couldn't do it is this. And that's because they're really motivated by knowing that they're safe and that they're secure. The third type of person is motivated by autonomy or power and control. So if you think of somebody flipping the bird, that is somebody who's saying, I'm trying to take back power and control. So if you can communicate to them that whatever the services that you're providing is in some way going to help them be in control or get credit for being a leader, those are really good things to message. People that fall into the ring finger category are all about relationships. So they're going to want to hear what's in it for them in terms of how does it impact the relationships with others. And people who are pinky finger people are fairness and justice. And if you think about back when you were kids, you used to do pinky promise. And so these are people who are going to want to know, they're going to be motivated by how is this going to make the situation more equitable for everyone. And the reason I share all of this with you is that you want to be communicating with end users. You want to be sharing with them what's in it for them. And that way they'll actually use whatever solution it is and they'll understand the benefit and the value. But you have to basically craft 5 messages if you have a lot of different types of people. Now, you can do some stakeholder assessments, and we'll get into those in a little bit when I talk about more in-depth change management. But at a very minimum, just know that there are these different types of people in your organization. There are some really broad general buckets, right? You can say that customer service people tend to be all about relationships. You can say sales people tend to be all about status. So depending on what the services that you're providing, the change that is going to be impacting and who's going to be impacted by it may play into what's communicated and how and when. But if you cover those 5 bases, that's really super helpful. So I'm going to talk about organizational change management, and I really think that there is some work streams that we should be looking at. And this is not necessary unless you're doing a pretty big change to do all of these things, but I just want to run through them so you know what they are, and you can be advising your clients on what they should be thinking about. So really understanding the reason for the change, the business case for the change, and the governance. We talked about a lot of that in terms of the project. Those same things need to be happening for end users that are utilizing the solution that you're providing, and understanding why were you hired and what is the value that your service or solution is going to bring for them. And then if whatever you're doing is going to change either the employee day to day or the vendor's day to day, it's really important that you understand what their role in that change is going to be. Is it going to impact their jobs? Is it going to require that they learn new skills? Do we need to look at reward or recognition systems to make sure that we're driving the correct behaviors? You're going to need to do the communication and answer the what's in it for me. You're going to want to communicate via lots of channels why you're doing this, what to expect. And we'll talk again a little bit more down the line about developing some pretty robust communication strategies. And then training. So any ongoing training that needs to happen, it might be a small change and you could just do a video, but you need to figure out if there needs to be training. And if so, make sure that you cover off training in the multiple ways that people learn. So some people learn by reading, some audibly, some by touching and feeling. And so you're going to want to really think through what training needs to be done. And as you can see, if your client's thinking about all these things while you're still providing the service or you're implementing your solution, you're giving them the heads up to plan and prepare for all of these phases. So change management should be running in parallel with project management. And just like we talked about in project management, that there are different phases, there are different things that need to be done within the change management plan that are running in parallel. So early on, when you were still trying to figure out your project and all the discovery, that's when you should be doing some things like assessing what's the impact of that change going to be. Is the culture able to do a change? What changes are you asking people to make? All of those sorts of things. We want either you or your client to be building out who's going to be in charge of driving the change, what training needs to be done, what's the planning going to be. We're going to actually create the plans, and then someone's going to have to execute those plans. And then as you start to implement the solution or whatever change you're creating, there will be resistance. And so you need to have a plan on how you're going to manage that, and then how you're going to transition this project-based change into ongoing operations. So some key artifacts that I use, I have some tools that are pretty easy to use. They're just Excel spreadsheets. And again, understanding how big the change is that you're going to implement is really important. And so you can just go in here and you can do a rating of, how many people and is it multiple areas of the organization? What's the impact to the users? And then we would assess their culture as well. So how good are they at implementing and executing change? Have they done a lot of change initiatives before? Is the messaging really clear as to why? Are the executives the type that walk the walk and talk the talk? It's really understanding the organization and what's available just in terms of culture. And then to take the time to sit down and to understand what are all the changes that the organization has going on at any given time, what those priorities of those changes are, because this is really going to drive decisions about what gets implemented and what doesn't, and what needs to be communicated and when, and what the priorities are. And then from there, we talked about this as the minimum viable product. Is you could just say, I know that all salespeople tend to really be motivated by status. And so in terms of communicating this change, we are going to create a reward system or some kind of a competition. That can be one strategy. But if you want to get a little more in depth, what you can do is a stakeholder assessment, and you can start to mark who are the people on the project, or you can identify different departments and really start to understand, do they have a positive understanding or a negative understanding? Who are they in communications with? Are they well prepared from a training perspective? Are they likely to sabotage the project? So these are all things to be thinking about with the end users, really, right? Who's going to be impacted by this, and what's their understanding of what we're doing and how we're doing it? Because this will really drive into how many communications you have, what kind of communications, and does the messaging get changed for the different groups? In the change management, I would encourage your client to be having stakeholder meetings where they're understanding that what's going on with the project plan, but then they're also understanding what's going on with the change management work streams. And so this is really helpful to say, okay, what are the inputs to this meeting? What are we covering in this meeting? And then what is the outcome of this meeting? So I just like this from a structure to communicate to everyone, this is what to expect. This is what you're going to get out of these different meetings. They can use this model in communicating to their end users as well about what's coming up with the project and the changes that they're being expected to embrace. So let's look at a communications plan. This is a really robust one. Again, it doesn't have to be this difficult if it's a smaller project, but it is really good idea as you get into more complicated projects to understand what all you need to be tracking. And there's everything from what is the strategy, so what are we going to do, to the communication objective, to who's going to deliver it, when are they going to deliver it, who's responsible for it, did it get actually delivered on the day that it was supposed to. One of the things that a lot of organizations seem to forget is that there's usually a hierarchy of approvals when it comes to communication. So when you start to build your plan out and you work the dates backwards, make sure that you account for the manager who wants to understand what their end users are going to be communicated, will want to have a review of it and want to have a say in it. The executives will want to have a review and will want to have a say. So earlier on in the project, you need to figure out what that approval process is and how long and how many days you need, so that you can then say, all right, I need to have the draft written by Wednesday, so that the manager can review it on Thursday, the executives can review it on Friday, the marketing or communications team can actually get it scheduled on Monday, so that we can actually hit send on Tuesday. And building that all out is going to save you a lot of heartache and rushing around at the last minute. There are some really, really important things when it comes to communication. The number one thing that I'm going to stress here is that you want to create opportunities for two-way communication, and that you cannot just communicate one time. It takes people, I've heard everywhere from 5 to 12 times to understand. So just make sure that you're communicating frequently, that they understand what's in it for them, and that you're using multiple methods and multiple voices to communicate any changes that are going to occur. You'll also need to develop a training plan. And so it's great to give them, your client will need to develop a training plan. You may or may not do it for them, but they'll want to think about what training is needed. Who is the audience for the training? What are they supposed to get out of the training? Do they need to book a room for the training? Is there documentation that needs to be created? Are there videos that need to be created? Where are we going to store those videos? All of those sorts of things. Who's going to update? What happens when a new employee is onboarded? Do they need to be made aware or trained in any way, shape, or form? So all things to take into consideration, listed out here. Basically, the same thing, that there's usually typically a development stage. There's a develop the material. There's make sure that there's a review. That make sure that there's approval, and understanding what all of those are within a training project a training plan is really important. And then in order to make sure that people are adopting or utilizing the change that you're implementing, it's really good to have super users. And I consider super users as the people that are really well networked, who people listen to. They're the unofficial leaders in the organization. A leader or a CEO can say all day long that you should do this or you should do that. These are the people who at the water cooler have the clout, and they'll be able to be on your side to help guide you if there's any communication gaps. And they'll be the ones that'll most likely be the one-on-one help to anybody who's in the field that is frustrated or struggling. And so you really want to identify who these people are and engage with them early and often. Make them feel special, make them feel important, because they are. And if they aren't at the very beginning, they will be at the end. So the earlier you can involve them and engage them and get their input to those communication plans and those training plans, the better off you'll be. As we discussed, you could do the best communication in the whole wide world. You can have super users in place. There will potentially still be resistance. So resistance is because people are busy and they're tired and they're overwhelmed and inundated with endless amounts of changes every day. And our brains are hardwired to recognize when something is different, and it takes us a little bit of time to accept that change. So just remember that you, as the person implementing the project, found out weeks and weeks ago about why this project was being implemented. Your client, who is then communicating to their end users, found out about this weeks and weeks ago. The people who are being impacted or expected to use said service probably aren't at the same place that you are. And that's really hard to remember sometimes. So be prepared for resistance, be aware of what it might look like, and have a plan for how you are going to mitigate that. I will give one example of, we did a huge project where we needed everybody to delete a significant amount of emails. And we knew that we would get to the day that everybody was supposed to have it done, and it wouldn't all be done. And so we set up ahead of time what will happen, that we would go to their managers and that their managers would give them 3 days. And if it wasn't after 3 days, that they would be turned into HR, and HR then would deal with it as sort of like an insubordinance issue. But we mapped all of that out ahead of time so that everybody was super clear on what we were going to do, how we were going to do it, what the impact was if people didn't do the things that they were being asked to do, because those were such critical success factors in the reason that they had spent all the money to utilize our service and to have us build the solution and all of those sorts of things. So all just great stuff to be educating your end users on. As always, here is my contact information. If you would like access to any of my templates, I am happy to share those. One of my favorites is this Communications That Works checklist. So even if you're not going to do a big full communication plan, definitely understand who's going to be your audience, what's in it for them, what's the style of the message, who's going to need to approve it, how many touches, and who's going to monitor the feedback for SLAs and responses and things like that. So this is a worksheet that I'm happy to send over to you. For more in-depth projects, I do have my handy dandy Excel spreadsheet that is highly customizable. I do sometimes share this with people, sometimes I just use it internally, but we can talk about that if that is something that you are interested in. So as always, here to make sure that your project is going off as smoothly as possible, that anything that you do is actually getting used. And again, change management, not a requirement, but definitely something that can absolutely differentiate you. If you choose to do change management, do it during the build phase. If you choose not to do change management, the next thing is we're going to finish up this project. And when it's finished, we're going to do a project closeout and lessons learned. So stay tuned for that in our next video. Thanks and have a great day.